We often imagine good people as harmless, kind, and morally superior. But what if that image is incomplete, if not entirely wrong? Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher of pessimism, believed that beneath the surface of kindness can hide repressed rage, suppressed desires, and dangerous illusions. The truth is, even the purest hearts can carry the darkest shadows. In this video, we'll explore how Schopenhauer's brutally honest philosophy reveals the hidden side of good people, and why ignoring it comes at a cost. The image of a good person is often one of restraint, someone who is calm, polite, forgiving, and selfless. But Arthur Schopenhauer, a philosopher who saw straight through human illusions, warned that this kind of goodness is not always what it seems. What appears to be moral virtue may in fact be repression, a hiding away of natural instincts that are deemed socially or morally unacceptable. And the problem with repression is that it doesn't eliminate these instincts. It buries them alive. Every human being possesses aggression, envy, lust, and the will to dominate in varying degrees. These impulses are part of the primal core of the psyche, what Schopenhauer referred to as the will, a blind, irrational force that drives all existence. The so-called good person may believe they've overcome these urges, but in reality, they've often just pushed them out of consciousness. They've learned to wear a mask of virtue while hiding a storm beneath. But repressed instincts do not simply vanish. They fester, they rot, and in time, they find their way out. In passive-aggressive behavior, self-sabotage, righteous cruelty, or explosive emotional outbursts. That is the dark irony. Those who try hardest to be good often end up developing the most dangerous shadows. They become ticking time bombs of moral restraint. Think of the kind, generous friend who never says no, who always avoids conflict, and who suppresses their anger again and again. Eventually, a moment comes. Someone says something small, barely offensive, and this friend explodes with fury, shocking everyone. That rage wasn't born in that moment. It was accumulated over years of denial. Schopenhauer understood that repression is not a virtue, but a danger. The denial of one's darker impulses only strengthens their hold. The more someone tries to eliminate their anger or jealousy entirely, the more those forces twist into toxic, unconscious behaviors. What we refuse to face within ourselves often gains control over us in secret. This is why some of the most seemingly good people can become incredibly vindictive when challenged. They've worked so hard to craft their identity around being selfless and kind that any suggestion otherwise threatens the very foundation of their ego. They respond not with humility, but with quiet malice. Their goodness becomes brittle, easily shattered, and dangerously defended. And so Schopenhauer invites us to ask, is the good person truly good, or are they simply afraid of their own shadow? If they've never faced their inner cruelty, their selfishness, their will to power, how can they truly claim to be good? Real moral strength, in Schopenhauer's view, requires facing these truths, not hiding them behind polite smiles. What appears to be moral virtue is often little more than a hunger for approval. Schopenhauer believed that at the heart of all human action lies the will, a blind, insatiable force that drives everything we do. And even good deeds, which appear selfless on the surface, can be secretly powered by a will to be admired, validated, or elevated above others. This idea deeply unsettles those who view morality in black and white terms. We're taught to believe that good actions spring from good intentions, and bad actions from selfishness. But Schopenhauer complicates this view by showing us how self-interest disguises itself, especially in those who seem the most virtuous. The truth is, many people don't want to be good. They want to appear good. They crave recognition as a moral person. They want to be praised for their humility, applauded for their compassion, seen as above reproach. This is not goodness. It's image management. It's ego cloaked in virtue. And this is where things turn dark. The desire to appear good often leads people to become manipulators. They perform kindness when others are watching. They donate, not to help, but to be seen donating. They speak softly, not out of genuine gentleness, but to maintain the illusion of sainthood. Behind the scenes, they may gossip, control, or punish those who threaten their moral superiority. This behavior is especially dangerous because it's hard to detect. Unlike overt cruelty or aggression, the will to be perceived as good is wrapped in charm, humility, and social grace. But it creates a subtle hierarchy. These people begin to look down on others who aren't as selfless, as refined, or as enlightened. They judge, not openly, but with condescending smiles and passive disapproval. Their morality becomes a mirror in which they admire themselves. Schopenhauer warned that this need to be morally superior can even lead to cruelty in disguise. The good person might shame others in the name of righteousness. They might enforce rigid rules, not because they care about justice, but because it maintains their position as the moral authority. In extreme cases, they become tyrants of goodness, believing that their cruelty is justified because it serves some greater moral purpose. And yet, they are blind to their own motives. They believe their actions are pure because they've convinced themselves that they are good. They never stop to ask why they need to be seen that way. They never examine the craving for admiration, the fear of moral failure, or the pride in being better than others. This lack of self-awareness makes them dangerous, not because they intend harm, but because they think they're incapable of it. In Schopenhauer's view, this is one of the greatest illusions of all, to believe that your virtue makes you immune to vice. In truth, the desire to be seen as good can be just as corrupting as any selfish impulse, perhaps even more so, because it's hidden beneath layers of social approval and internal denial. Only by questioning why we want to be good, by facing the darker motivations underneath, can we begin to act with true integrity. Until then, much of what we call goodness may be nothing more than a refined mask for the ego's endless hunger to be seen. There is a subtle yet corrosive danger that arises when a person begins to see themselves not just as good, but as better. This is the silent creep of moral superiority, a shadow that often grows unnoticed in those who live with the intention of being virtuous. Arthur Schopenhauer, with his deeply pessimistic view of human nature, warned that the so-called good person can fall into this trap without ever realizing it. And when they do, their goodness transforms from something humble into something prideful, arrogant, and spiritually toxic. Unlike arrogance based on wealth, beauty, or intelligence, moral superiority is far more insidious. It hides behind politeness. It disguises itself as compassion. It wears the mask of humility. But underneath, it is driven by ego, a belief that I am more righteous than others. I live by a higher code. I would never do what they did. And in Schopenhauer's eyes, this kind of ego is not a sign of enlightenment, but of self-deception. This kind of superiority doesn't always express itself in obvious ways. It's not loud or boastful. In fact, it often comes in the form of quiet judgment. The good person may never say they think they're better, but they feel it. They may smile kindly at others while secretly seeing them as less evolved, less disciplined, less enlightened. They see their own kindness as a badge of honor and view the moral failings of others as confirmation of their own elevated status. This inner hierarchy, the invisible moral scoreboard, distorts how they view the world. They begin to divide people not by their humanity, but by their virtue. Those who agree with their values are deemed worthy. Those who fall short, even slightly, are subtly looked down upon. And here's the most dangerous part. Because they believe they are good, They assume their judgments must also be good. They no longer question their own thoughts, because they've placed their conscience beyond suspicion. What begins as genuine morality curdles into moral vanity. Schopenhauer understood that the will to feel superior, to rise above others, is embedded deep in the human psyche. Even in the act of renunciation or self-denial, there can be hidden pride. Some people give up desires not because they are truly detached, but because they want to feel more spiritual, more holy, more elevated. And when this becomes the driving force, the ego has simply changed form. It has not disappeared. It has disguised itself as virtue. This transformation is especially dangerous because it makes honest self-reflection nearly impossible. A person who is proud of their intelligence might be willing to admit when they are wrong. A person who is proud of their strength may eventually recognize their limits. But the person who is proud of being morally good often sees no reason to examine themselves. They believe they are the standard. They think, if others lived like I do, the world would be a better place. This mindset can lead to devastating consequences in relationships and communities. The morally superior person becomes inflexible. They cannot forgive easily because they see failure as weakness. They cannot accept difference because they see disagreement as immorality. They cannot grow because they assume they have already arrived. In extreme cases, this mindset becomes oppressive. Parents use it to control their children. Religious leaders use it to shame their followers. Activists use it to silence dissent. In each case, the justification is the same. I am right. I am good. Therefore, anything I do to uphold my values must also be right and good. Cruelty, control, and punishment are rebranded as necessary acts of moral enforcement. But Schopenhauer's philosophy pierces through this illusion. He would argue that true goodness is not concerned with being better than others. It is concerned with seeing others as they are, flawed, struggling, just like you. He would say that humility is not pretending to be small, but recognizing that we are all driven by the same irrational forces, the same will, and that moral superiority is simply one more illusion created by the ego to maintain its power. True goodness, then, must be rooted not in pride, but in compassion. Not in feeling superior, but in remembering that no one is immune to failure or temptation. It must be grounded in awareness of one's own darkness, not in the fantasy of purity. Because only when a person confronts their own capacity for wrong can they offer understanding instead of judgment, and mercy instead of control. Schopenhauer's bleak but honest insight into human nature reminds us that the desire to be good must always be tempered with self-awareness. Without that, even the most well-meaning individuals can become self-righteous, blind, and subtly cruel, believing they serve the good, while actually serving only their own inflated sense of self. There is a deep confusion in our culture between goodness and weakness, between being selfless and being self-erasing. Many people, especially those who strive to be morally upright, fall into the trap of believing that to be good means to constantly sacrifice themselves for others, to tolerate mistreatment, and to put everyone else's needs before their own. But Arthur Schopenhauer, in his relentlessly honest view of human nature, saw this kind of self-denial not as noble, but as deeply pathological. In Schopenhauer's eyes, to live a life entirely in the service of others at the cost of one's own dignity is not a sign of moral strength. It is often the result of fear, guilt, or a desperate need for validation. People who believe they are being good by constantly giving themselves away are often trying to escape some inner pain or avoid confronting their own desires. They silence their anger. They suppress their boundaries. They convince themselves that their value lies in how much they endure. But there is a dark side to this so-called goodness. When a person becomes a doormat in the name of virtue, when they allow others to walk over them and smile through it, they are not being kind, they are betraying themselves. Schopenhauer would argue that this betrayal is not just harmful, it is self-destructive. It leads to resentment, emotional burnout, and the slow death of the self. This kind of person becomes trapped in a cycle. The more they give, the more they are taken for granted. The more they tolerate, the less they are respected. And yet they continue, because they believe that to stop sacrificing would make them selfish. They confuse having needs with being immoral. They believe that standing up for themselves somehow cancels out their virtue. This mindset is often reinforced by cultural or religious ideas that glorify suffering. In many societies, the image of the good person is tied to martyrdom, to enduring hardship silently, to forgiving endlessly, to putting others first, no matter the cost. But Schopenhauer rejected this idealized view. He saw suffering as something real and raw, not something to be romanticized. To suffer for a cause, or for someone else, might be noble in specific moments. But to live a life of constant self-abandonment is not morality, it is misery. What's worse, this excessive self-sacrifice often creates a perverse kind of pride. The person who suffers constantly may begin to see themselves as spiritually superior, as if their endurance makes them more pure or more righteous than those who refuse to be used. They begin to define their identity by how much they can tolerate. But this isn't goodness, it's martyrdom as ego. It's pain being used to feed a sense of self-worth. Eventually, this leads to bitterness. Even the most self-sacrificing person, if unacknowledged or unappreciated for long enough, begins to rot inside. Their repressed anger bubbles beneath the surface. They might not lash out openly, but their kindness becomes tinged with resentment. They feel owed, they feel unseen, and the very people they tried to please begin to sense that something is off. The mask of endless giving begins to crack. Schopenhauer would say that the root of this problem lies in misunderstanding the nature of morality. To be good does not mean to erase oneself. To be compassionate does not mean to abandon self-respect. A truly good person is not someone who tolerates abuse. They are someone who recognizes the humanity in others and in themselves. They have boundaries, they have needs, and they know that self-sacrifice, if not balanced with self-awareness, becomes self-harm. He might also argue that some people cling to their goodness because they fear the alternative. They are terrified of seeming selfish, aggressive, or flawed, so they swing entirely to the opposite extreme. But this is not balance. This is avoidance. True moral integrity lies not in always saying yes, but in knowing when to say no. It lies in choosing to help others when it is right, not when it is demanded or expected. Moreover, Schopenhauer understood that the world is not kind to those who abandon themselves. In his pessimistic view, life is already full of suffering. To add to it by voluntarily becoming a servant to everyone else's will is to multiply pain unnecessarily. And pain to him was not to be worshipped. It was to be understood, minimized, and navigated with honesty. So when we talk about the good person, who is always sacrificing, always yielding, always suffering, we must ask, is this really goodness? Or is it a refusal to stand up for the self? Is it love? Or is it fear? Is it morality? Or is it the quiet tragedy of someone who was never taught they were allowed to exist fully, to take up space, to speak, to resist? In the end, Schopenhauer's message is simple but uncomfortable. If your goodness is destroying you, then it is not goodness. It is something else entirely, something that needs to be examined, challenged, and transformed. Because you cannot give to others what you've denied in yourself. And a person who sacrifices everything will eventually have nothing left to offer. The most dangerous illusion of all is the belief that we are wholly good. This illusion, so often wrapped in kindness and selflessness, becomes a mask that hides our darker impulses, not just from others, but from ourselves. Arthur Schopenhauer, with his unflinching gaze into human nature, insisted that true moral clarity does not come from denying our darker tendencies, but from facing them. Until a person confronts the shadow that lives within them, their goodness remains superficial, fragile, and incomplete. Schopenhauer did not believe in the perfectibility of man. In fact, he considered the human will to be inherently irrational, driven by desire, selfishness, and blind striving. Even the so-called noble deeds, he argued, were often performed under the influence of hidden motives, pride, guilt, fear, or a desperate attempt to construct a meaningful identity in a meaningless world. And so, for Schopenhauer, the path to genuine moral character required one thing above all: honest self-examination. Most people avoid this examination. It's uncomfortable. It forces them to ask hard questions. Why do I really help others? What do I gain from being seen as good? Is my kindness sometimes a mask for control, or a way to avoid confrontation? These questions peel away the moral self-image that many people cling to and expose the complexity underneath. But this exposure is essential. Without it, the good person becomes trapped in a one-sided identity. They invest everything in appearing kind, selfless, and morally upright. But they become blind to their capacity for cruelty, selfishness, jealousy, and resentment. And when those darker emotions inevitably rise, as they do in all humans, they are not dealt with directly. They are projected, rationalized, or suppressed. The person begins to lash out in passive ways, punish others in the name of morality, or collapse under the pressure of their own impossible standards. Schopenhauer would argue that this repression of the shadow is what leads to the most subtle and dangerous forms of harm. A person who has never accepted their capacity for evil cannot recognize it when it starts to control their behavior. They may gossip under the guise of concern. They may manipulate in the name of righteousness. They may judge others with quiet malice while convincing themselves it's for their own good. Their moral blindness becomes a weapon, not against evil, but against complexity. Carl Jung, building on Schopenhauer's legacy, would later describe this dynamic in terms of the shadow, the repressed aspects of ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge. But Schopenhauer saw it too, in his own way. He knew that morality without self-awareness is often just a well-lit disguise for the will's darker urges. And he challenged us not to live without these urges, but to know them, contain them, integrate them into a fuller understanding of ourselves. Because only when you recognize your own darkness can you begin to choose the good with sincerity. Only when you admit your own selfishness can you act with real generosity. And only when you acknowledge your own rage can you understand compassion as something more than politeness. Goodness that comes from repression is fragile. It cracks under pressure. But goodness that emerges from confrontation, from wrestling with the truth of who you are, is powerful, lasting, and real. To confront your shadow is not to become immoral. It is to become whole. It is to stop pretending that you are something you are not, and start living in conscious harmony with the parts of yourself that you once tried to deny. This is the path of wisdom, not moral perfection, but moral honesty. And this honesty demands that we let go of the fantasy of being better than others, that we stop measuring our worth by how cleanly we can suppress our impulses, that we admit that we, like everyone else, are capable of terrible things, and that it is only by facing that truth, rather than hiding from it, that we can begin to act with real integrity. Schopenhauer would argue that the person who has looked into their own soul and seen the chaos there, who has not flinched but accepted it, has a better chance of being truly good than the one who tries endlessly to be perfect. Because they are no longer controlled by the need to appear good. they are not afraid of what they might find within. And so they are able to act with humility, clarity, and depth. In the end, the dark side of good people is not that they are secretly evil. It is that they are often unaware of the very darkness they carry. And until they turn inward, until they stop performing and start reflecting, that darkness will continue to shape their lives in invisible, insidious ways. The true path to goodness, as Schopenhauer saw it, runs not through denial, but through courage. The courage to confront what we are, in all our brokenness, and choose a better way from that place. Arthur Schopenhauer was one of the most brutally honest philosophers in history. His views on life, suffering, and human nature were famously bleak. But it was his shocking opinions about women that stirred the most controversy. In a world that was starting to romanticize love and equality, Schopenhauer took a dagger to illusion and exposed what he believed were uncomfortable truths. He confessed what most men didn't want to admit, and what most women refused to hear. This video isn't about hate. It's about understanding the raw, unfiltered mind of a man who saw the world differently. Whether you agree or not, what Schopenhauer said might just explain a lot more than you think. Arthur Schopenhauer was not known for being gentle with his words. When it came to women, his thoughts were not just controversial, they were incendiary, even by the standards of his time. In his essay, On Women, he launched a philosophical grenade that still echoes today. To Schopenhauer, women were not the romantic, angelic beings portrayed in poetry or courtly love. Instead, he described them in cold biological terms, as instruments of nature, designed with a single purpose in mind: the continuation of the species. This wasn't personal bitterness, he claimed. It was pure, logical observation. He believed that the idealization of women was one of the great delusions of modern man, and that until this illusion was shattered, men would remain trapped in roles of servitude and emotional dependence. Schopenhauer didn't just question women's nature. He outright rejected the growing idea that women were equal to men in intellect, creativity, or moral strength. To him, these were comforting lies societies told themselves to avoid confronting the brutal truth. He argued that women were short-sighted in thought, incapable of deep philosophical insight, and fundamentally pragmatic, concerned with survival, family, and status, rather than with lofty ideals or noble pursuits. Their charm, beauty, and gentleness were not spiritual qualities, but survival tools, he claimed, evolutionary strategies for securing male protection and resources. In Schopenhauer's coldly rational world, everything had a function, and that function was reproductive. He didn't hate women, per se. Rather, he saw them as playing a role that nature had carved out for them, just as men had theirs. But where men suffered was in mistaking the performance for reality. They fell in love with the illusion, not the individual. They projected ideals onto women that no real person could live up to. And when the illusion inevitably collapsed, when beauty faded, affection waned, or betrayal occurred, men were devastated, not because they were wronged, but because they had lied to themselves. Schopenhauer's critique, then, was less about women and more about men's inability to see clearly. He urged men to stop worshipping false gods and start confronting the truth, even if it was bleak, even if it hurt. Central to Schopenhauer's philosophy was the idea that love is not noble or transcendent. It is nature's cruelest trick. He insisted that romantic love is nothing more than a biological trap designed to fool men into reproducing. On the surface, love feels intense, intoxicating, even divine. It drives men to create art, write poetry, and make lifelong sacrifices. But underneath all the passion, Schopenhauer believed, lies a ruthless evolutionary mechanism. He wrote that men do not choose who they love. Nature chooses for them. Nature selects a partner not based on compatibility, kindness, or intellect, but on the likelihood of producing healthy offspring. And once that purpose is fulfilled, once the children are born, the illusion evaporates. What remains is often conflict, resentment, and confusion. He argued that the very things we think are personal, our taste in partners, our longing for connection, our heartbreak, are actually impersonal forces beyond our control. Love, in Schopenhauer's view, is the will to life acting through us. The will is blind, irrational, and cares nothing for our happiness. It only wants to survive, to reproduce, to continue the species. That's why men are often drawn to women who seem irrationally captivating, because, subconsciously, their bodies have been selected by nature to trigger desire. But once nature gets what it wants, the mask drops, and then begins the slow, painful realization that what felt like destiny was merely biology. This perspective strips love of all its poetry. It reframes relationships not as partnerships between equals, but as temporary alliances forged by evolutionary pressure. For men, this realization can be devastating. They invest everything, emotionally, financially, spiritually, into a bond that may have been programmed to dissolve the moment its biological purpose is achieved. Schopenhauer believed that unless men woke up to this manipulation, they would continue to be used by forces they barely understood. And perhaps worst of all, they would continue to blame themselves when things fell apart. To many, these ideas sound heartless, but Schopenhauer believed he was offering men a form of liberation. If love is not sacred, then neither is heartbreak. If desire is not destiny, then neither is suffering. To see clearly, even if the truth is ugly, is better than to live in beautiful lies. In his view, men had to stop being slaves to illusion, stop imagining that love would save them or that women would complete them. Only then could they reclaim their power. Only then could they begin to live by reason instead of instinct. One of Schopenhauer's most provocative arguments was his claim that society clings to a dangerous illusion, the myth of female moral superiority. He observed that throughout history, women have often been portrayed as gentle, pure, nurturing beings, embodiments of kindness and compassion. From the Virgin Mary to the romanticized heroines of literature, the feminine ideal was lifted high, far above the base instincts and destructive impulses typically attributed to men. But Schopenhauer rejected this narrative outright. He argued that the widespread belief in women's innocence wasn't rooted in truth. It was the result of centuries of idealization, chivalric delusion, and willful blindness. In his words, society had created a goddess out of convenience, not out of reality. He believed this idealization served a specific function. It allowed men to justify their sacrifices. Men went to war, built nations, died young, and worked themselves to the bone, all under the banner of protecting and providing for women. If women were seen as morally superior, then men's suffering became noble. But Schopenhauer called this a lie, a self-deception that kept men enslaved to a fantasy. He claimed that women were not morally better or more virtuous. Rather, they simply had different forms of expression, shaped by biological necessity and social constraints. Their behaviors were not born from higher principles, but from instincts geared towards survival, reproduction, and resource acquisition. He pointed out that much of what is interpreted as feminine virtue, modesty, humility, tenderness, is not evidence of deeper goodness, but a form of strategic self-presentation. He described women as the weaker sex, not just in physical terms, but in will. He believed that women were more inclined to follow convention, to seek security, and to act through manipulation rather than open conflict. According to Schopenhauer, these tendencies were not inherently evil, but they certainly weren't signs of moral greatness either. They were practical tools developed over centuries of depending on male provision and protection. And once those tools were mistaken for moral virtues, men were bound to misjudge the reality of their relationships. Schopenhauer was particularly disturbed by what he saw as the hypocrisy of modern gender roles. He noted that men were held to high standards of duty, courage, and achievement, while women were praised simply for being. A man who failed to provide or protect was shamed. A woman, on the other hand, could fail in her responsibilities and still be seen as morally upright, simply because of her perceived emotional sensitivity. This double standard, he argued, led to an unbalanced society where men carried the weight of civilization, yet were expected to remain silent about their disillusionment. He wrote that many women were childlike in reasoning and lacking in the ability to comprehend great ideas. This wasn't meant to insult, he claimed, but to describe a fundamental difference in how men and women process the world. Men, to Schopenhauer, were shaped by struggle. They were hardened by competition, intellect, and suffering. Women, he argued, were protected from these things, and so remained closer to nature, governed more by emotion and instinct than by abstract reasoning. This, he believed, was the real reason women seemed more peaceful or morally clean. They simply had fewer opportunities and less capacity to engage with the darker, more complex aspects of life. In the modern world, Schopenhauer warned, this illusion had grown even stronger. As societies advanced and women gained more visibility, the ideal of the morally superior woman only intensified. Media, literature, and education reinforced the narrative that women were humanity's emotional compass, kinder, wiser, more in tune with what matters. But Schopenhauer would have none of it. He believed that this new mythology was not a sign of progress, but of increasing delusion. By failing to see women as they truly were, flawed, human, and just as capable of vice as virtue, men remained vulnerable to manipulation and heartbreak. They continued to put women on pedestals, only to be crushed when reality failed to meet expectations. Perhaps Schopenhauer's most unsettling suggestion was that most men didn't want to see the truth. They preferred the illusion. They wanted to believe in feminine innocence, not because it was real, but because it gave their suffering meaning. It allowed them to feel like heroes, martyrs, and lovers in a grand romantic tale. But to awaken from that dream, to truly see the other as an equal in flaws, capable of both great love and great cruelty, was to lose that meaning. And for many, that loss was too great to bear. In the end, Schopenhauer's goal wasn't to demonize women. It was to expose the fantasy that kept men emotionally enslaved. He believed that only by rejecting the myth of female moral superiority could men achieve true clarity and inner strength. Only then could relationships be built on reality, not illusion. His message was harsh, unflinching, and deeply unpopular. But for those willing to listen, it held a radical form of liberation. The freedom to see things as they are, not as we wish them to be. Schopenhauer believed that one of the great silent tragedies of modern life was the unspoken suffering of men. While the world celebrated romantic love, feminine beauty, and the sacredness of family, he saw something much darker hidden beneath it all. A quiet army of men who had surrendered their lives to illusions and were paying for it in silence. From a young age, Schopenhauer argued, men are conditioned to believe that their worth comes from what they can give, build, or endure. They are not taught to value themselves for who they are, but for how useful they are to others, especially to women and society at large. This conditioning begins in childhood. Boys are often praised for being strong, independent, and self-sacrificing. If they cry, they are told to toughen up. If they speak of loneliness, they are told to distract themselves with work. And if they ever question the expectations placed on them, to provide, to protect, to persevere no matter what, they are labeled weak or unmanly. Over time, this creates a man who no longer knows how to express pain. He learns to suppress his emotions, to wear a mask of confidence even when he is drowning inside. Schopenhauer saw this not as strength, but as tragedy. He believed that men were being used, not by women directly, but by the hidden forces of nature and culture working through them. Romantic love, according to Schopenhauer, is one of the most effective tools for this manipulation. A man falls in love not because he freely chooses to, but because nature drives him toward a woman who will best reproduce his traits. He feels passion, longing, and devotion, but underneath all of it is the will to life using him as a pawn. He sacrifices his dreams, his wealth, sometimes even his sanity, in the name of this love. He may marry, have children, and spend decades providing, only to find himself discarded or forgotten when he is no longer useful. And when that happens, society does not weep for him. It tells him he should have tried harder, that he was never enough. Schopenhauer found this deeply unjust. He pointed out that men, far more than women, are likely to face existential despair when relationships fail, because so much of their identity has been tied to being a provider or protector. They often have nothing left when those roles vanish. They are left with empty bank accounts, broken homes, and a society that ridicules their pain. Worse still, when men do express frustration or criticize the system, they are accused of bitterness or misogyny, further silencing their voices and reinforcing their isolation. In Schopenhauer's eyes, this suffering was not random. It was systemic. Men were not simply unlucky in love. They were trapped in a structure designed to exploit their biology and their sense of duty. Women, guided by the same natural instincts, seek protection, stability, and upward mobility. These instincts are not evil. They are just nature's design. But when combined with a culture that idealizes women and shames male vulnerability, it creates an imbalance where men give everything, often receiving very little in return. And yet they are told to be grateful, to be proud, to suffer quietly as a badge of honor. So what, then, is the solution? For Schopenhauer, it wasn't to hate women or relationships. It was to awaken, to see clearly. He urged men to detach themselves from the illusions that bind them. Stop thinking that love is salvation. Stop believing that sacrifice will earn you happiness. Stop assuming that suffering in silence makes you noble. He wanted men to reclaim their minds from the grip of fantasy, to understand that they had been seduced not by individual women, but by the deeper forces of the will, forces that cared nothing for their well-being. And yet, this awakening is not easy. To reject the myths of romance and feminine perfection is to step into a lonely, often uncomfortable truth. It means letting go of dreams you were taught to hold sacred. It means facing the fact that much of what you believed about love, purpose, and identity may have been built on lies. But in that destruction, Schopenhauer believed, there is also freedom. Because once a man sees the world as it is, not as he wishes it to be, he is no longer a slave to it. He can begin to live with clarity, with self-awareness, and with a kind of inner strength that no external validation can give him. This was Schopenhauer's ultimate gift to modern men. Not bitterness, but liberation. By exposing the illusions, he offered the chance to rise above them. In a world that constantly demands your loyalty, your sacrifice, your silence, perhaps the most radical thing a man can do is to open his eyes, to see clearly, to think freely, to choose a life not shaped by instincts or manipulation, but by his own reason and understanding. Schopenhauer's philosophy, though dark, contains a rare kind of hope. The hope that truth, even when painful, is better than ignorance. That clarity even when it isolates you, is better than blind devotion. He did not expect the world to listen. He knew that most men would continue to worship illusions, to sacrifice for love, to suffer in silence. But for the few who dared to question it all, for the few who sought something real, his words were a confession, a warning, and perhaps most importantly, a call to awaken.